Hello today, three clips, and we're going to continue the ideas series with a bit of a recap and move forward, and it's mainly via the mind of Mervyn King, the boss of the Bank of England, but everything's pertinent to ideas and what's going on in the world. Right, Stephen King writing in the Financial Times. Stephen King, I think, works for HSBC as their chief economist. Heed churlish Mervyn King on limits of QE. Now, the article, all of it's encapsulated in the title there. Heed, take note of, churlish, probably a bit stubborn, and made his mind up and probably might stick to it. Mervyn King, the man, on the limits of QE, not just the limits of QE, but the limits of central bank action. That's what the central bankers are saying at the moment. We've done everything we can. Now it's up to the politicians to do things. In Apocalypse Now, Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries dun, da, 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 dun, da, 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 provides the soundtrack to the dirty deeds of the American helicopter crews. I don't know whether Sir Mervyn King, Governor of the Bank of England, and avid classical music buff, has been listening to Wagner recently, but he clearly shares Francis Ford Coppola's horror of helicopters. Now, I've touched on this before. I'm stressing it again because I think it's important. In Sir Mervyn's case, however, the source of his angst is monetary, not military helicopters. So the stress is, and I'm going to quote from a speech he made last weekend, and I listened to a speech he made at the LSE the week before, and the questions he was given at the LSE, and basically they're very scared little chickens, these central bank people. They say that they can do so much and they have done it, and they don't want to do special things because that special things aren't their job. Right, so however the source of his angst is monetary, not military helicopters. In another Financial Times article, linked obviously, I'll just read it and then explain afterwards. It may sound radical to say that the budgetary implications of quantitative easing correspond exactly to a debt write-off, but let's compare them. In the case of QE, the coupons, that's the interest rate, the interest, are paid to Her Majesty's Treasury to the Bank of England Asset Purchase Facility Fund. These coupons are the property of Her Majesty's Treasury and will be remitted back to the Treasury. In the case of a debt write-off, the coupons never leave Her Majesty's Treasury in the first place. Hence, the fiscal benefits of cancelling the debt would be precisely zero. Remember, that was one of the other options, helicopter drops, or just cancel the actual bonds that have been bought by the central banks. Just tear them up, let everybody know they've been torn up, they're in the bin, we can forget about them. In other words, the debt, equivalent to around 30% of the UK's overall debt, has, from a budgetary perspective, already been effectively cancelled. Now, first thing to note is in the United Kingdom, the central bank has been buying government bonds, the gilts, as opposed to in the United States, the Fed has been buying mainly mortgage-backed securities. So we're dealing in a slightly different thing here. But just to show the complications and why people can deny things like MMT is right and other things when it ever comes to things like this, everything is always done in a complicated way. Now, I don't think it's done in a complicated way, particularly on purpose. I think it's just because legally things have to be set up in certain ways. But we can say quantitative easing, who's actually buying these gilts, these UK government bonds from the outside world? Is it the Treasury or is it the central bank? It's actually neither. It is this Bank of England Asset Purchase Facility Fund, which was set up by, well, it doesn't matter who it was set up by, quite frankly. It was set up. It's a special investment vehicle. It's a SIV. It's apart from the Treasury and from the central bank, but both the Treasury and the central bank signed into existence, and its raison d'être is written by both of them. It sounds so boring. This is why people never follow it. Okay, so we've got this SIV set up by both of them that's going to do the buying of the bonds. It's written into its charter that it can borrow from the central bank really cheaply at 0.5%, I think it is. But and it's written into its charter that when it's to be wound up, any profits or losses, this would have been written in by the central bank. Central banks hate taking losses. Any profits or losses will be accrued to or taken from the Treasury. But it's run mainly by the central bank. So it's the central bank that says when it's to be wound up. And this is quite crucial because at the moment, what's happening, huge amount, 30% of UK's overall debt has been bought by this Bank of England Asset Purchase Facility Fund, borrowing money at 0.5%. And I think the average coupon of the bonds that they've bought is 2.7% or something. This little sieve is making a fortune. If it was a hedge fund, it would be, the directors would be buying new mansions and yachts all over the place. Okay, but the central bank says, we say when it's finished, when it's to be wound up. And they say it's to be wound up at the end of quantitative easing. At the end of quantitative easing is when not they've bought all the bonds that they're going to buy, but they've sold all the bonds that they've bought. This sieve would be selling them back into the economy when everything recovers. And when the central bank says they've sold them all back into the economy, doing the money manipulation to get the interest rate back up, then they'll do the maths, the math to see whether it's made a profit or a loss, and then that will go or be taken from the Treasury. But at the moment, there's technically huge quantities of money in there. I think they're making nearly 10 billion a year at least, and that money could be used now. But the central bank says we haven't finished with it yet, so the Treasury can't have it. I thought it was worth going through that just to show the hoops of trying to work out, well, what's going on. You can't often definitively say what's going on because as soon as you go into the details, it just goes off into grey areas. Anyway, hopefully that was interesting enough, and I'll finish with just one paragraph from Mervyn King's speech at the weekend. Starting with the FLS can only be a temporary scheme. The FLS is the new lending scheme where they lend to banks even cheaper money if they promise to lend it out. The window of opportunity which provides must be used to restore the capital position of the UK banking system. Still so important to the hearts of central banks is the state of the banking system. I am not sure that advanced economies in general will find it easy to get out of their current predicament without creditors acknowledging further likely losses. That's the banks. A significant writing down of asset values and recapitalisation of their financial systems. What it is saying is, at the moment, things are just in the air and grey and nasty. But if we want to move forward, well, we'll get this at the end. But basically, the banks are going to admit that they've still got huge losses on their books, and somebody, the government again, is going to have to recapitalise them. Again. This because it's the UK with the main banks already hugely owned by the UK taxpayers. Only then will it be possible to return to a more normal provision of the vital banking services so crucial to an economic recovery. In other words, the banks need to be recapitalised before they'll lend. I think Mervyn's wrong there, but still. But in the speech, he's referring still back to the Great Depression, which he has been for the last 5 years. He's always referring to the Great Depression. Mervyn King's have no doubt at all that this episode is comparable to the Great Depression. In the 1930s, faced with problems of sovereign and other debt similar to those of today, the pretense, and Japan, the pretense that debts could be repaid was maintained far too long. We must not repeat that mistake. Now he's saying, go and sort it out. I'll try and help where I can, but go and sort it out. But you creditors, mainly the banks and people that are owed money, have got to accept somewhere along the line that they are not going to get paid back the 100 on the whatever it was. They're not going to get all their money back. To make this beautiful, a beautiful deleveraging so we can move forward again, mainly the creditors have to accept that they're not going to get all their money back. And that's what Mervyn's saying. But it's very, very hard to tell creditors that they're not going to get their money back. They dig their heels in individually, and there's no leverage to get them moving, to start them, say, taking haircuts. And that's where we still are, and probably always will, not always will be. Time will move on. But something has got to move the creditors to accept credit write-downs and get this deleveraging to be much more beautiful than it is at the moment. Thanks for sticking with that. Bye.